Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you to my History Reaction channel. Today we'll be continuing The Cold War by Oversimplified. This will be part 2 of 2, and as always I will have a link to Oversimplified down in the description below. Please consider heading over to that channel and showing some support if you like what you see here today. We always want to encourage our original content creators to keep producing this wonderful content for the rest of us to enjoy and to learn from. Alright, with that said, we're just going to pick up where we left off. We basically covered the Russian Revolution, the rise of communism under Lenin and Stalin, the division that's growing between East and West over what Churchill termed the Iron Curtain, a division where the eastern half was pretty much closed off to the West, and it was very difficult to know what was going on over there. We talked about things like the Berlin Wall, Checkpoint Charlie, the Berlin airdrop, and today we'll get into further escalation of the Cold War as we start seeing the great superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, start engaging a lot more into proxy wars. So these two countries are rivals, but they're not fighting each other directly, typically. The Cuban Missile Crisis is an example where we came really close, but primarily we fought each other through spycraft, through espionage, that kind of thing, and economic means, as well as especially proxy wars. That's where one of the two superpowers would sponsor one side of a conflict, the other would counter by sponsoring the other side in a conflict. And it led to some of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century. We're talking Korea, Vietnam, and many others. Afghanistan was part of the proxy wars. There's literally dozens of them. Well-known, like the ones I just mentioned, others not so well-known. So we'll get into all that with part 2 here, so let's just get into it.
This video was made possible by Skillshare, an online learning community where you can learn just about anything. Support my channel by signing up using the link below and get your first 2 months for free.
All right.
For anyone who thinks recent U.S. history has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you the 1960s, extreme cultural division, major political assassinations, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. Yeah,
so I was born in the late 60s. The 60s were definitely a very turbulent time. For all the reasons you just said, you have this huge spike in assassinations during this time. Here in the United States, we had Kennedy, both JFK and RFK, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. But it's not just here, it's happening all over the world. There are other assassinations and assassination attempts as well. So it's a very turbulent time. You've got the counterculture movement, especially when we start getting into things like Vietnam. A lot of protests against wars, again, Vietnam in particular, which last all the way through into the 70s. You have racial tensions. This is the civil rights movement. There's just so much going on in the 60s. It's a very turbulent time. Anyway, enough about that. Let's keep going.
By the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, a certain Fidel Castro met with a certain Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City, and the two of them decided they should grow some awesome beards and overthrow the Cuban government, which...
Someday we need to take a deep dive on Che Guevara. He is quite the character. He is a doctor by education, and he is just skipping from revolution to revolution, whereas Lenin lived and breathed revolution. He did it more he was more of a statesman and an agitator and a philosopher, and then later a leader. Che is more getting directly involved, hands-on dirty type of revolutionary, but he's just as obsessive by all appearances to revolutions, because he gets involved in multiple revolutions. Not just a Cuban one here, but a couple of others as well. And I think he's somebody I would like to learn more about, and I think it would be a good topic to tackle at some point, is a closer look at Che.
This is exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a communist regime being set up in its own backyard. So the U.S. immediately began training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, Kennedy wanted to conceal any U.S. involvement in the plan. So he massively scaled back American air support, and as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat for America. But
okay, so let's talk about that very briefly. I did do a full video series from Extra History on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So other than a few primary or direct quotes from some people involved in it that I've looked up before starting this episode, I want to kind of just refer folks over to that for details on the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the Bay of Pigs, a lot of what's happening right here, right now, was planned under the Eisenhower administration. Kennedy kind of inherits the operation. He carries on with it, but like he said, Kennedy wanted to minimize any appearance that we were directly involved in this. He wanted it to appear to be primarily or exclusively a Cuban rebel movement. So he does scale back air support and other kinds of support in order to distance ourselves, meaning the United States, from what's going on there. And he fails miserably. The operation fails, and everybody knows we were involved. So I don't know how much he gained there. It was an early disaster in his administration, and it is going to put a lot of pressure on him to be more decisive in future incidents involving communism and so on and so forth. It's going to put a lot of pressure on him to redeem his image in the wake of the Bay of Pigs.
Castro felt there was still an impending U.S. threat to his regime. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a lot of medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America, but they could if they were positioned, say, on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida. Hey, I'm a communist who hates America. You're a communist who hates America. You know what that means? We should fall in love. I was just going to suggest you set your missiles up in Cuba. Oh, no, you're right. That's a better idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba noticed something strange. Sir, you need to look at this photograph. You're right. That's the cutest dog I've ever seen. Sir, I was referring more to the Soviet missiles.
Okay, so this is the era before we had satellite technology like we do today for spying. Now, that's not to say we didn't have satellites. We did have... This is the period when we were starting to get our first satellites up there, but spy satellites, in terms of taking detailed close-up pictures, are not in the picture yet. What they're using are things like the U-2 planes, which are high-altitude planes which take pictures for intelligence purposes. One is famously, and I think they mentioned this in the previous video, shot down over the Soviet Union at Francis Gary Powers. Or not over the Soviet, well, yeah, over Soviet airspace, put it that way. There's been a lot of incidents with U-2 planes. There's going to be more here during the Cuban Missile Crisis because one's going to get lost and end up over the Soviet Union as well. Another one is going to get shot down, if I remember correctly. So U-2s are being used a lot at this time as part of the Cold War. They are basically reconnaissance planes. And yeah, they get these images of Cuba, missiles on Cuba. They're very hard to see the missiles in these earlier pictures. They do later flybys much closer to the ground so they can get better images. The initial ones, if you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to see them. Later images, it's much more clear.
America freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable, and they had to act fast. They knew that airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba would likely mean nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So Kennedy came up with another idea, a blockade.
No.
The U.S. Navy announced...
Okay, no. People use the term blockade a lot, but Kennedy very, very deliberately did not use the term blockade because that implies a declaration of war. What he used was the term quarantine. And I actually have a direct quote from Kennedy on this issue. So let's take a look at what he actually said. This is in a address during the Cuban Missile Crisis on October 22nd, 1962. It can be found in the JFK Library. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. So he's very careful on several fronts here. He uses the term quarantine, not blockade, because blockade has a military connotation that he does not want here. He is trying very hard not to escalate this situation any further than it already has gone. Also, he's turning away, he's inspecting all ships coming in, not just Soviet or Cuban ships. In fact, the first ship he inspects is a different country altogether, and I don't remember which one it is. Greek, I think? But he goes out of his way to make this a quarantine and not specific to the Soviets, so that he can kind of at least try to keep the tensions a little lower. Sometimes terminology, sometimes exactly how you say things matter, especially when you're dealing with tense situations like this.
It would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviet put its military into full combat readiness. The U.S. did the same and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications between the two sides broke down as Khrushchev rejected Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed. And for the first time in history, U.S. Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2.
Okay, that's very oversimplified, but again, I'll just put a link to our Cuban Missile Crisis series down below if you want specific details on how all that went down. Feel free to check that reaction out. Extra History did a pretty good job with that video for the most part.
DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and two of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the third senior officer, this beautiful man, refused to authorize the decision. The U.S. finalized its...
I mentioned this in a pinned comment in the Cuban Missile Crisis series from Extra History, my reaction to it. That particular incident, there is some debate on exactly what happened aboard that sub, but the general gist from everybody that was directly involved with it is that that's basically what happened. Now, whether the captain really intended to launch or if he was just expressing frustration has been a key point of debate. In other words, we don't know how serious the intention to launch really was. We just know that that particular gentleman refused to even consider it, and that may very well have saved everybody from a potential outbreak of nuclear war. That ship was ready to fire a nuclear torpedo because they thought they were under attack and they had no way to communicate to find out the truth. And rather than surface and risk being sunk, they were ready to fire.
Preparations, and I kid you not, the day before the U.S. were set to decide the day and time for the Cuban invasion, Khrushchev was like, hey, you know if you just removed your missiles from Turkey, we'd remove ours from Cuba? Yeah, that sounds good to me. It was a bit more complicated than that, but at the last second, the two sides finally came to an agreement. Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba, and the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief.
Okay, a couple things about that. Again, if you want details, go over to the Cuban Missile Crisis series. But yeah, the United States did agree to pull those missiles out of Turkey. Kennedy kind of wanted to do that anyway, but he had to get around resistance from Turkey and other allies to do it. And part of the agreement that he made with Khrushchev was that Khrushchev would get his missiles out immediately, and then Kennedy would get the missiles out of Turkey a few months down the road so that it didn't appear like Kennedy was capitulating and doing an exchange with Khrushchev. He wanted it, that was a face-saving thing on Kennedy's part, where he could claim that, no, I'm doing this because we want to do this, to not because it's part of a bargain to get Khrushchev out of here. But I got a couple more quotes from the Cuban Missile Crisis. I've got one from JFK that we've already listened to. Here's one from RFK. This is a discussion with the ambassador Dobrinin. Dang it, I had trouble saying that name. But if we start to fire in response, a chain reaction will quickly start that will be very hard to stop. A real war will begin in which millions of Americans and Russians will die. So this is part of the negotiations where RFK, Robert Kennedy, is really emphasizing to his Russian counterpart that it doesn't matter who starts this, it's going to be bad for everybody if it continues. There's going to be a chain reaction. It's going to escalate out of hand, and before you know it, there may be nuclear launches, and then it's all over for both of us. And then here's one from Khrushchev. This is something that he sends in a letter to a missive to Kennedy. If, however, you have not lost your self-control and tentatively conceive of what this might lead to, then, Mr. President, we and you ought not now to pull on the end of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war, because the more the two of us pull, the tighter the knot will be tied. And a moment may come when that knot will be tied so tight that not even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it, and then it will be necessary to cut that knot. And what that would mean is not for me to explain to you, because you yourself understand perfectly well, or you yourself understand perfectly of what terrible forces our countries dispose. So that is a missive that is available in online. I can give you, well, not online, but in the Foreign Relations archive, and I will in a pinned comment down below include the reference number if you want to take a look at any of this. So both sides understood the gravity of the situation. They understood the consequences. There was a lot of blame to go around on both sides. You'll hear people arguing constantly, debating constantly on, well, whose fault was it? Was it Khrushchev for doing ABC before this started? Was it the United States under Eisenhower and Kennedy doing ABC that led up to it? It's a lot of both. Both sides did things that led up to this. Placing the missiles in Turkey contributed to this. Some things that Khrushchev does before this escalate tensions and create this kind of a problem. Certainly sending the missiles in the first place secretly is going to contribute to this. You have other things as well involved in this. For example, things like the Bay of Pigs and multiple assassination attempts on Castro. That contributes to this because that puts Castro in a position of looking for help, and the Soviets have a great opportunity then to exploit the situation to kind of balance out the presence of missiles on their doorstep by putting missiles on our doorstep. So there's a lot of blame to go around on both sides. The big thing is when push came to shove, the leaders on both sides, and by the leaders I mean Khrushchev and Kennedy specifically, understood the potential consequences and understood they needed to find some way out of this on both sides without losing too much face, without appearing weak, because that would open both of them up to political consequences. So it's really a tough dance they did, and I think they both deserve a lot of credit for what they did, because they had a lot of people in their staffs, respectively, that were agitating for war, that wanted to fight. Bobby Kennedy in the beginning wanted to fight. Fortunately, we had John there saying, that's the last thing I want to do. If we have to, we will, but think about where this leads. That's when you get... And Bobby Kennedy does come around pretty early. And Khrushchev is fighting that same fight back home as well, where you got people who want to escalate it, or you got people also who want to de-escalate. It's really complicated. Again, there's a lot better sources than Oversimplified for this, but that's why I like Oversimplified. It gives you a big picture and then gives you some things to explore in more detail through other videos or through looking in scholarly papers, primary sources, or even just biographies or general works of history that aren't scholarly literature, but still well-researched. It's a great tool for pointing you in a direction to find out more about what you want. Anyway, enough about that. I'm spending way too much time on this considering I've already covered it in the Extra History series.
Except for one guy, who was bloody livid. Phew! Let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. Unfortunately for him, his presidency was to end with one. Having nearly blown up the planet, a few changes were made. First, the superpowers agreed to a limited test ban treaty.
Right.
Secondly, the Soviets ousted Khrushchev and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a kisser.
Yes, he was.
To kiss. Both sides were deeply concerned at the prospect.
When I was a kid, Brezhnev actually kind of scared me whenever he was on the news. I don't know what it was. I think maybe it was the eyebrows, but there was just something about his face. He actually kind of scared me.
Of nuclear war. But still, the arms race raged on throughout the 60s and 70s. U.S. intelligence worked out that the Soviets' nuclear arsenal was not as powerful as they previously thought, but in fact, it was America that held the advantage. ABMs and MIRVs were developed, and the doctrine of MAD. If both sides knew they would be complete.
Mutually assured destruction. Yep.
Destroyed by a nuclear war, neither would risk starting one. But even without war, the world was already feeling the effects of nuclear weapons. In 1966, above the pleasant town of Palomares in Spain, a U.S. bomber collided with a tanker mid-air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It hasn't exploded, so I'm sure everything's fine. Whoa, boy. Hey, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Okay. What were you gonna do today? Go for a swim? Yeah, I wouldn't. Are you breathing right now? Yeah? Yeah. I wouldn't. It took the Americans 2.5 months to find one of the bombs, which had gone missing in the ocean. This was the 14th time America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950. Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. So sleep well tonight.
Yeah, we covered a little bit of this over the last week when I was doing lead up to this series. I did a lot of things on the atomic era and nuclear accident. I know they dropped a couple bombs over North Carolina. Goldsboro, I've been there. I think in a previous video I said South Carolina like an idiot. I went to both Carolinas plus a lot of the southern states all in one big long 10-day trip. So I kind of misremembered where I was, but it was North Carolina. There's been several times where we've lost nukes. Most of them get recovered, but there are still some, not necessarily here, but around the world, that are definitely unaccounted for. As well as in some of the other videos, we see other incidents that are not related to weapons, like with the Kramatorsk incident. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. It's actually kind of interesting and tragic. These kind of things happen, and this is something that is going to happen throughout the Cold War. It still happens today because we use a lot of radioactive material throughout the world. And a lot of countries now that have nuclear technology and several others that are pushing very hard towards it. So it's getting increasingly problematical. Yes, we are not building them at the rate we used to, but we really don't need to. How many times do you need to be able to destroy the world before enough is enough? You don't really need that many nukes. You just need enough that nobody will dare attack you because it's guaranteed you'll be able to wipe them out. That's all you need.
After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East, Vietnam. Back in the 50s, the Vietnamese had kicked their French colonizers out once and for all, and the country was divided into two.
So it had been French Indochina. The French were in control. They get kicked out, and it kind of descends into chaos at that point. And then it turns into a proxy war, which is what we're getting into here.
North, a communist regime, and in the south, an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators. And
this is just a replay of the Korean War, because the same thing happened there. Both sides ended up with ruthless dictators. Both sides are supported by rival countries. And it just gets turned into a long, bloody conflict. For the United States, Vietnam is horrifying. And he'll get into more of it, I'm sure, so we'll just continue and comment as we need to. We definitely need to do a deep dive into Vietnam at some point.
Both dreamed of reuniting Vietnam under their own regime, so the North established the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the South with Soviet support. The U.S. sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese to deal with the threat, but President Diem's brutal policies pushed more and more South Vietnamese to support the Viet Cong, and over the next decade, the situation escalated to a breaking point. America feared the domino effect. That is, if South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand? Burma? India? LBJ had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops, and so in they went. From 1965, America found itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought before.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember the Vietnam War. I was too young to participate by quite a bit. My dad probably should have gone. He was drafted, but he got out because he had a chronic ulcer at the time, a bleeding ulcer. So they kicked him out, basically. They didn't let him in. So he kind of lucked out. But my mother had a cousin that was shot down in Operation Starlight. I believe he was actually the first casualty of Starlight. He was a gunner in a helicopter. As soon as they got in range, he got shot. So yeah, a terrible war. In the 65 onward, especially, when America goes from just supporting to actually actively participating, it really gets vicious. And the way that the the Vietnam veterans were treated when they came back is just horrible. I don't think I need to get into that, but I think most people are familiar with that story. But in case you're not, there was such a protest against the Vietnam War, especially as it drug on under Johnson, that people were angry at the returning troops. They weren't considered, American heroes. They were villainized by a lot of people. Not everyone, by no means everyone, but enough. Enough that it led to long-term issues, both, from PTSD from the actual fighting, but also from shock at the reception coming home. Because instead of welcoming them home, a lot of times they were greeted with derisiveness, with venom. So it's really a tragic event in American history.
Let's play Spot the Viet Cong Soldier.
There.
Of course not. That's because millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight a ruthless enemy who used the thick jungle as its shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was, or worse, who it was. And as a result, the civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire. The city of Saigon found itself under regular attack, and America launched a bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder. The Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia to supply the campaign. It was a long and brutal war, and I could never do it justice in this video. But in terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably the biggest of many, many global conflicts that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear war, the two superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive, and as a result, their ideological battle shifted away from the potential of direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the US backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw US-supported South Africans fighting Soviet-supported Cubans. In the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, the superpowers interestingly switched sides as regimes changed. And
that gives you an idea of just how much this is about ideology and not any specific geographic advantages, so to speak. It's about ideology. If the regimes change, they flip sides. It would almost be absurd if it wasn't so tragic how many people died because of these ideological confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. The people on the ground in these countries were fighting for their own reasons, but for the United States and the Soviet Union, it was a lot more ideological, and they were getting involved to support whichever side lined up more with their ideologies.
The US continued fighting the spread of communism in its own backyard, funding the famous Contra groups to fight the socialist junta in Nicaragua. These proxy wars were fierce enough to begin with, but superpower intervention amplified the destruction and created alarming levels of human suffering.
Look at all those, and that's not even a complete list. Yeah, he brings up the Contras. I definitely remember that incident and the entire Iran-Contra hearings where you had Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North testifying in a hearing revolving around, was the United States selling weapons to Iran to fund Contras? So there's just so much going on. There is so much blood being spilled over all these wars between these countries that are being made much hotter than they might have been, or prolonged in some cases, because of the interference of the United States and the Soviet Union. It's just really tragic, and it comes back to bite both sides in the long run in many cases, because a lot of the problems we're having today stem from a lot of these proxy wars. Some of the forces that we funded, for example, in Afghanistan to oppose the Soviets there, ended up giving them weapons and training and equipment that they've more recently been using against us. Anything happened in Iraq, Iran, you name it. This is a common problem. We set up these puppet governments. We set up regime change like we do in Iran when we overthrow a democratically elected ruler, a president basically, and replace it with a Shah, because that serves our interests or the British interests, the American and British interests, we'll put it that way. And things like that. All of this come back later to really bite us in the backside. And the same thing with the Soviet Union. They created a lot of problems for themselves because of these involvements. And some of the groups that they helped fund and weapon and to turn against them later on. So, yeah. When you look at groups like the Mujahideen, I said that wrong again. Mujahideen, thank you. Sorry, I'll get there eventually. First of all, that's a generic term, technically speaking, for anybody who's fighting on behalf of a jihad. But it's become, in modern times, more associated with terrorism and Afghanistan in particular. But it really is just a generic term for anyone who's fighting for a cause along the line of a jihad. So, yeah. So many of these groups we're dealing with now, ISIS and all the others, can be traced back to a lot of these conflicts and were partially funded by one or the other or both sides. In some cases where things flipped. It's just crazy.
Throughout the Third World, and in Vietnam, that human suffering was all being broadcast back home via good old television. Going into the late 60s, America was a changing nation. This became this. This became this. And this became this.
Okay, let's talk about that, because I mentioned earlier the 60s were a time of turmoil, and And what he just showed there was colored drinking fountains, is what they would have called them back then, and regular drinking fountains. This is part of the entire separate but equal doctrine, where the Supreme Court ruled that you could have separate facilities, separate drinking fountains, separate schools, separate restrooms, so on and so forth, separate seating in cases like buses, dining areas, based on race or whatever criteria you want, as long as they're equal. The problem, of course, is it was never equal. Funding for regular public schools are not the same as coloring for African-American public schools. The restroom facilities were definitely not as good, typically, for the African-Americans as they were for everybody else. So later, when you get Brown versus the Board of Education, where they rule that separate is by definition not equal, and that this has to stop. So that happened as part of the civil rights movement in the 60s. And it's really major set of changes that are happening here. And we're still dealing with a lot of it, but this was a period where a lot changed. And at least in my opinion, a lot of it was for the better. Certainly the separate but equal thing, it never was equal. I happen to agree with that particular ruling. And it just never made sense to me. Of course, I'm biased. I grew up at a time, it was still there a little bit when I was young, but I didn't live in a part of the country where it was really an issue. So, yeah, we'll just take that for what it is.
New slogan that was taking root: make love,
right,
not war. The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War.
Oh, yeah. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?
1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War appeared to be increasingly unwinnable and public opinion turning increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home and ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam by 1973. 2 years later, the South fell. The Cold War was now taking its toll on both superpowers. In Russia, a huge percentage of the budget was still going to the military. People were still hungry, and they just didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. And what did they have to show for it? They weren't even winning the space race anymore. Both sides needed to reduce spending in order to rescue their economies, and so both welcomed with open arms an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as détente.
Right.
To improve relations, Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev returned the gesture a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT Agreement that limited nuclear weapons. Relations with China were even improving via ping-pong diplomacy when the U.S. table tennis team went on a tour of the People's Republic. However,
yes, and they took Forrest Gump along with them.
Internally, China was still pushing anti-capitalist propaganda, which led to some mixed messages. Nixon even visited China in 1972, and it was a barrel of laughs.
Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
You put the stopper into his ears so that he couldn't hear the criticism.
Give me a pair.
Yeah, Nixon. I was alive during this period. I remember his presidency pretty well. I remember Watergate. One of the sad things about Nixon is if he had just not been so corrupt, he might have gone down as a pretty decent president. Yes, he had a few minor issues, but he got a lot of positive things done. He got us out of Vietnam. He did pretty good later, especially later in his term, in terms of foreign relations, including this trip to China and his visit to Moscow and so on and so forth. If he just had behaved himself and kept people under him under control, and most importantly of all, not tried to cover it up, because that's really what got him, he might be rated as one of our better presidents.
Everything was going great for Nixon, until it was uncovered that back home he was being a very naughty boy and violating constitutional protocol. I'm announcing today my resignation as president, and I'm passing the office to my vice president, Gerald Ford. Wow.
Gerald Ford, yeah. I'm sure most people know this now, but Gerald Ford was not elected vice president. He was a representative. I believe he was a minority leader in the House. He's the first vice president that was ever elevated into office due to a recent amendment that provided for that, because that had not really been covered before. Nixon's previous vice president had been Spiro Agnew. Agnew had been forced to resign due to corruption issues. So yeah, Gerald Ford had the distinction of being the only man who's ever been president that wasn't elected to the executive branch.
Wow. You mean in America that people can actually remove their leader when he breaks the law? Why not just rule by force? Where's the corruption? And my first act as president is to pardon Nixon. There it is. After the whole fiasco, America...
Yeah, a lot of people did see that as corrupt. Others saw it as just a gesture to get the country past this and to move on. That's how Ford himself framed it. But yeah, a lot of people saw that as a corrupt move.
Decided what they really wanted was just a nice, safe guy who wouldn't cheat on them. So they elected Jimmy Carter, and the two sides met in Vienna, where they signed yet another strategic arms limitation treaty. It's an honor, Premier Brezhnev. Likewise, President Carter. Please don't do that. But that
Carter years were interesting. There was a huge oil crisis at the time, gas shortages, there was gas rationing. I can definitely remember that period. Personally, I loved Carter. I just really liked Carter. He was the first president I ever really paid attention to in anything even remotely resembling a serious way. And I know he had a lot of issues during his time of office. One of them being that sometimes he was a little too honest. The Great Malay speech would be a good example of that, where he basically comes out and says everything is bad, and if we want to fix it, we're all going to have to get together. We're going to have to make some sacrifices as a country in order to improve things. And I would argue that he was probably just being brutally honest with the country, that he was saying it like it needed to be said, but it wasn't what people wanted to hear. They wanted to hear, I can fix it, I will make it better. Not, you're going to have to sacrifice and work with me to make it better. Yeah, and when we're talking about Carter, I think, and he kind of hints at it here, and I agree with him, the reason Carter won was because he is what this country needed at that time. We just gone through Vietnam. We just gone through the period of the civil rights movement. We just gone through a period of multiple assassinations throughout the 60s, including political assassinations here at home. We had the Watergate scandal. All of these things going on. The country, what it needed more than anything else at this time was just somebody that they could trust. That somebody that felt normal, I guess would be a way to put it. And I think Carter was the right man for the time. And that's the part of his presidency I don't think gets enough emphasis among historians and even just people who look back at him. Because we tend to talk about what he did during his office and the long-term consequences of all that. But I think he was what we needed. There's a reason he won. And it wasn't because people thought he was going to be a great president or strong leader, because that's not what they wanted at that time. They just wanted somebody that wasn't going to lie to them, that wasn't going to continue what's been happening over the past couple of administrations. And that's something we need to kind of, when we're looking back at some of these things, we kind of have to look at things like that too. When we're talking about presidencies and was this a good president for this time, we definitely needed a different person for a lot of what happened under Carter. But the type of person that we needed to do that might have been, it had other issues because that was not the type of person that the country wanted at that time. Anyway, I hope I'm making sense on that. As somebody who lived through that period, that was the vibe I got back then. That's why I was so interested in him, was because he was a breath of fresh air. I knew so many people were upset over Nixon. So many people have been upset over LBJ. People were upset over Ford. So, and that's, even though I was fairly young, I was able to sense that. And when Carter came along and everybody was just happy about it, well, not everybody, but again, enough, a goodly amount of people, at least where I lived, it was very obvious. And of course, his election takes place going into the bicentennial celebration. So it was a very patriotic period. Really interesting times.
That's not to say there was no longer any tension between the two sides, because there was.
Oh,
Heaps
yeah.
of it. Once again, the Soviet Union put down further attempts at reform and rebellion in the Eastern Bloc. The Euro missile crisis saw new and improved classes of intermediate-range missiles being deployed in Europe. In 1979, the Soviets thought it would be a good idea if they had their own Vietnam and invaded Afghanistan to prevent a US-sponsored Islamic insurgency. And in response to these various crises, Olympic Games were boycotted.
Right.
Conservatives were
And we talk a little bit about the 1980 Olympics in the video on the Kramatorsk incident, because the Olympics in Moscow indirectly lead to that accident.
concerned that US policy had become too soft. And in 1980, they decided they wanted a president who would be tough on communism, so they elected Ronald Reagan. And Reagan came in guns blazing.
Oh boy, did
Concerned
he.
of the Soviet Union's human rights violations, he made a speech calling them an evil empire. And he also wanted to renew the arms race using technological advances in computing and lasers. He came up with the Space Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars,
Yep.
which was basically a big defensive anti-nuke shield around the country. But a lot of people thought it was a pretty dumb idea. The Soviet Union perceived this shift in rhetoric as the USA getting ready for war, and they were feeling especially threatened as their relationship with their communist ally China had broken down. Relations took a big hit in 1983 when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner that had strayed into their airspace, and it looked like the world was going right back to mid-20th century Cold War tension. But then Brezhnev got really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and he was replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev. Coming into office in 1985, he was the real game changer. His philosophy differed a lot from previous Soviet leaders. He felt that the reason the Soviet system and economy was struggling was that it didn't allow the Soviet people to find satisfaction in their work, because they weren't allowed to speak freely and lived in fear. Gorbachev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but unlike previous Soviet leaders, he actually made the change happen. Within the first couple of years, he began the political movement for more openness and transparency, and the restructuring of the Soviet political and economic systems. And change very quickly took effect. People could criticize the government, they could enjoy Western pop culture, the media interviewed Margaret Thatcher, but most importantly, the Soviet people could now enjoy Pizza Hut. All hail to Gorbachev. He also knew
That's a reference to the fact that Gorbachev actually does a Pizza Hut commercial. But yeah, they open a lot of the doors to American franchises. You'll get McDonald's moving into the Soviet Union, for example. And right next to the hotel I stayed in Moscow, my very first visit to Russia in Moscow was a shopping center, basically a mall. And they had a McDonald's in there. And I went in, and it was quite interesting. The Big Mac had caviar on it. I tried it. The food there is very different. The Coke, the Pepsi, especially Pepsi, because that's what they have more there, I believe. Tastes different than it does here. Of course, they've got different bottling plants and so on. Interesting stuff. But yeah, this period you see opening. More of the West is getting in, and to some degree, some of the people in this region are getting out to see the rest of the world. And in an ideal world, that would have been a major and good change, I think, for the Soviet Union. But it was a little too little, a little too late. Had that come earlier, I think it might have worked. But by this point, the Soviet Union's already struggling. is in trouble, and this just kind of doesn't really help. It's too little too late.
That the arms race needed to end in order to rescue the Soviet economy, and a positive relationship with the West must be established. Constructive dialogue reopened and resulted in the INF Treaty, which saw all intermediate-range missiles eliminated, which was huge. Reagan's tone towards the Soviet Union began to soften, and things were looking up. But what would these reforms mean for the Eastern Bloc? For decades, the Soviets had been brutally suppressing any attempt at change. Now, would they be allowed? And that was the exact question on Hungary's lips when the Prime Minister visited Moscow. Gorbachev's response: he didn't necessarily agree with the reforms, but he wouldn't stop them either. He was prepared to let the Eastern Bloc choose its own future. This was massive, and the Hungarian leaders began planning free, multi-party elections.
So, under Stalin, these countries were given the option, they were supposedly given free and fair elections to decide whether they join with the Soviets or not. And we talked about this last video. They were neither free nor fair. The exact nature of the issues in each country were a little different, but there was all kinds of voter fraud, there was voter intimidation, all of it was going on. This time around, it is going to be at least more free and fair. I'm sure there's still some of that going on, but not to the degree it was under Stalin.
Poland followed suit and also held elections in June. The anti-Soviet party Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. But not just that. In Hungary, the barbed wire border between East and West was removed. The Iron Curtain was unraveling. But not all Eastern Bloc leaders were happy. Notably, East Germany was still ruled by a hardline Stalinist, Erich Honecker, and many East Germans were still eager to get out. They had been trapped by the Berlin Wall, but now they were doing the math. If they could travel to Hungary, and Hungary's border with the West was loosening, could they now make it to the West? That summer, East Germans decided Hungary was the latest top holiday destination. They traveled there in droves, and using various methods, tens of thousands crossed the border into Austria and the West. Honecker was furious, and blocked travel to Hungary, but that civil liberties train had started rolling, and it wasn't stopping. Thousands more flocked to the West German embassy in Prague, where they stormed the fence around the embassy gardens, and a temporary refugee camp was set up. In September, deals were struck to allow the refugees to travel west via train. Back in East Germany, the people were running on a civil liberties high, and they wanted their next hit. Dissent was growing. Over time, demonstrations turned to mass protest, with plainclothes secret police officers doing their best to put down the dissent, but it had grown well out of their control. And worse, the biggest demonstration was yet to come. We're gonna put all of this down by force. Right, guys? Guys? Unfortunately, everyone had realized what he had not. This was bigger than them, and the entire East German Politburo voted him out of power. On November 4th, over 500,000 East Germans took to the streets of East Berlin. For many, there was still one big target left in their sights: that damn wall. The pressure on the East German government was too great, and on November 9th, they made a bit of a chaotic announcement that the travel ban between East and West was being lifted. The change wasn't meant to take effect until the next day, and crossing guards still had orders to shoot on sight any who tried to cross. But that night, huge crowds gathered at the crossing points, and the guards were overwhelmed. In an astronomically historic moment, after decades of family separation and travel restriction, the people were allowed to pass through. East and West Berliners couldn't believe it. And
I remember when that happened quite well. My father has a piece of the Berlin Wall, or he had. You know, he's passed on now. I don't know whatever happened to that. If it's still around, my brother probably has it. So yeah, I definitely remember that. I remember a lot of this going on because this was a huge deal in my lifetime. I was out of high school. I was living on my own for the first time. I had bought a house a couple years earlier and was living on my own and was watching all this on the TV. Really, really major moment in my life. I've had several. I'm old enough to have lived through several things. But for me, this was one of the big ones because it was an end of an era. All I'd ever known my entire life was the Cold War. To see this happening, to see it falling, to see the Soviet Union falling apart was, of course, huge to those of us who had grown up under this period.
Celebrated together throughout the night. Some even climbed the wall and began to topple it. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and a year later, Germany would be reunited. Elections in Bulgaria, a peaceful revolution in Czechoslovakia, and a violent one in Romania brought to an end communist authority in the Eastern Bloc. America decided it would be best if it just stayed away and let the change happen, as the anti-communist movement continued all the way back to Moscow. Gorbachev had given the people the freedom to demonstrate, Now, they demonstrated for an end to the communist single-party rule, and Gorbachev had to give in. For the first time in history, elections were held in which candidates not officially endorsed by the party were allowed to run. Ambitious rival of Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, led a growing democratic movement. Now things here get quite confusing, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a complicated topic.
Oh,
so
yeah.
believe me, this is oversimplified, but it went a little bit like this. The Soviet Union was made up of a number of smaller Soviet republics, the largest of which was Russia. Yeltsin got himself elected the president of Russia, and began a struggle for sovereignty against Gorbachev and the greater Soviet Union. Communist hardliners were horrified at what Gorbachev was allowing, so they briefly kidnapped him and tried to set up their own emergency government. But Yeltsin and his supporters all gathered around the White House in Moscow and were like, no, we have a tank. So the hardliners had to concede and released Gorbachev. Wow, thanks Boris. That was a close one. No problem. And thanks to you for all the great freedom you've given us. Anytime, pal. And just to inform you, I've used that freedom you've given us to go behind your back and make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union and set up the Russian Federation. In other words, you're no longer in charge. I am.
Yep.
Dude.
That's very oversimplified, but that does summarize it in a nutshell. We now have a Russian president, and because of that, he has this ability to say, hey, Russia no longer wants to be part of the Soviet Union. And he doesn't just do that, but he gets Ukraine and Belarus on board. So without those three countries, the Soviet Union just isn't going to stand.
So uncool. And so decades of tension and the everlasting threat of nuclear war finally came to an end as democratic governments were established in many of the old Soviet republics, and the world got along together forever after. Right, guys? Hey, this modern art thing is growing on me.
All right, I think that's the end of it, but World War III coming soon, I hope not. Anyway, yeah, so that is the Cold War, and you know, like I said, I lived through it. My wife lived through it. She was born in the Soviet Union in Siberia. She would have been fairly young when this happened. She's a decade younger than I am. And yeah, she remembers it quite well as well. And certainly her mother remembers it extremely well. So yeah, very interesting times to live through. And like I said, for me, it was the end of an era. It was everything I'd known from my entire childhood and the early part of my adult life just ended. The whole Cold War, all those tensions, the idea of a Soviet Union, it all ended. So it changed everything. It really did. Anyway, I hope you had fun this week between the Great Northern War and our lead into the Cold War here with topics on the atomic age and nuclear accidents, and I hope you enjoyed the Cold War itself here. This next week, I'm going to be doing a lot of shorter videos. I'm not going to be doing any more double features for the foreseeable future, unless it's something that's really short. If I have really short videos, I might pair a couple of them up, but I'm not going to do what I did this week again for a very long time, if ever. It was a lot of work. I've had a lot of requests for long-form videos like Great Northern War. In fact, I've had multiple requests for the series on Napoleon from Epic History TV. That one is, if I want to do the whole series that everybody's pushing me to do, is something over 30 episodes. And I don't want to tie up a month or more on a single topic. So I've been thinking about that a lot, and I've had other people who really want to see me keep pushing through Oversimplified. So what I'm going to do going forward, not this coming week, but starting after this coming week, we will be doing French Fridays, where we will be working our way up through all of Epic History TV's Napoleon series. So that will take a while, but we'll do one episode a week until we get through all of his basic episodes on Napoleon. I don't know if we'll do the one focusing on the Marshals specifically, but we'll do the Rise of Napoleon, we'll do the Napoleonic War. At the very least, we'll do those. And we'll do Oversimplified Saturdays. So that's my plan going forward. This next week, I'm taking a week to kind of back off from this overburden of this week. I will pick that up, though, not this coming week, but the week after that. We will be starting French Fridays and Oversimplified Saturdays. So that's something for folks to look forward to. I do have a few other requests that I want to get to. I will be tackling some of those as well as we go through this. So I hope you've enjoyed this week. I hope you approve of what I'm planning on doing with Napoleon, with Epic History, and I hope you approve of my plan for Oversimplified. I do want to honor requests as much as I can while this channel is still small, And I don't mind going through all the Napoleon ones. I don't know a whole lot about Napoleon, so I expect to learn a lot. Again, it's one of those areas. When it comes to military history, I generally only know the broad strokes. I don't get into deep dives unless it has to do with famine, disease, anything like that. So, to be a learning experience, I don't know how much I'll be able to contribute to any of those, but you guys have asked for it. Several of you have asked for that, so we will do it, and we will have fun with it. So I hope the plan meets your seal of approval, and that's what we're going to be doing. So thank you for joining me. Thanks to everybody who supported me this week. It's been a very good week. This past week, the size of the channel has doubled, which is just amazing. I don't expect to continue growing at that rate, but I really appreciate that this week has doubled. It blew my mind. I really did not expect that, so thank you all. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.